Hello, Mr. Miskew. Today I'm here to talk to you about my Summative, or my tools class. And first off, I'll talk about my two files, my Summative Python file, and then also my JCI text file, which includes, which allows me to change a text file through my functions. I'm going to start off with talking about my imports. I have two imports, my math module and my random module. I have a group of string functions, a group of list functions. Down, I have a list of math functions. I also have a list of reading and writing to files functions. I have 3 of them. And then error functions. The reading and writing to text file functions and my error functions are all concepts which are rather challenging for me because I didn't know how to do them at first. But now I think I have gotten a clearer concept of how they work. So I'm going to be starting off with my string functions, of course. And I'm just going to talk about the first instance I use core concepts. So here I have my isPalindrome function, my count character function, my count max block function, all of which deal with strings in some way or another. My isPalindrome function passes a string or an integer and returns true or false based on if it's palindrome. And it's my first instance of using a function that includes a conditional statement and a loop. It also includes a string and a loop, so that was my first instance of using that kind of function. And moving on, I've got my count character function, which passes a string and a character and counts the amount of times that character shows in that string and returns a sum, and it's rather quite useful. My last string function includes count max block, which is a rather difficult function to code at first, but all it does is it basically passes a string and returns the the maximum amount of that same character, and it does this through creating a counted loop and then basically changing the string and making use of the generate list function, which means I can return the largest element and therefore find the time or the largest amounts of integers in a row by dividing it each time there's a change in element. Moving on though, I will go on to my list functions, and here is just my first instance of using a list and a loop, and it basically finds the length of a list. You can do this through just calculating the length of the list, but I guess here's the actual code behind it. It's quite useful to see another way of counting the length of the list. Anyway, moving on, I have my generate list function, which is quite a useful function because it changes string based on a divider into a list with elements. And you can set the divider to anything you want, and every single time it sees that in the string, it will divide it and return that new list. Next function, generate random list, which is my first instance of using a function that generates a random value in some context, as it creates a list of a past length, and then each time it adds or appends an integer which is random in between the low setting and the high setting, and it returns that list, and it's always pretty cool when to see what it comes out with. Moving on, I have my list string, which takes a list and then keeps adding its elements to the string and returns that string. Rather simple. Next two functions involve another core concept. It's called reverse list A and reverse list B, and in both cases return lists that are reversed, but one creates a new variable of the past list, and then the other one makes use of the same variable. And this is quite useful because what this does, due to lists being reference variables, this one makes so that you can still go back to your previous list, but this one makes it so you use the same amount of memory, and you just completely change the list itself and replaces it with a reverse list. Both ways they append elements backwards is roughly the same though. And then my next function is remove elements, takes a list and removes all the selected characters in that list, and it does it by every single time it checks that the character is equivalent or not, it appends that character. and it returns the new list. Next function includes my first two element function, which checks whether or not the first two elements are equal to each other and returns true or false based on that. The next function is another example of a test function, and it includes first and last backwards. And what it does is it takes a list, it goes through every single element backwards, as the counted loop shows right here, and it keeps adding to a string. The string is the type of variable that's returned. It keeps adding to the string the first and last letter of each element backwards, so it looks quite nifty when it does come out. My next function is another test function, is adjacent check, which checks if the integer, or it basically creates a new list based on the past list of and past integer, and every single time it sees an element that is adjacent to the integer, it adds it to or appends it to a list and then returns that list. So it's quite nifty. Here's my showcase of calculating the largest and smallest element in a list function, and I call it min or max of list because you can either do both, and it passes two parameters, your list parameter and your min or max parameter, and returns either the smallest element or the largest, depending on whether you set it to minimum or maximum in the min or max parameter. Moving on, I've got my largest section of functions, my math functions. First function includes a round function, or another way to do it, kind of like my counting the amount of elements in a list. There's an easier way to do it, but it showcases core concepts. And what it does is it passes a float and then takes an integer and rounds that float down to the nearest integer, but adds 0.5, so it always returns actually the roundest number and returns that integer. And then my next function includes the max of 2, takes two integers and returns the largest one of the two. Next function includes the Pythagorean theorem, takes side A, length of side A, and length of side B, and returns the length of side C, which is quite useful. And then I have my generate factors function, which takes an integer and basically creates a list of that integer of all the factors, and does this by using integer division, and is rather useful. My next function is common factors, which actually makes use of generate factors twice, as it creates two lists of the factors of two integers, and then it creates a list and compares, and then that list contains all the common factors. And it does this in my first case of a nested counted loop system, and keeps appending elements to a list C. Next function is roughly the same. It's called factor sum, and instead of just taking two integers, it takes a list and one integer. And all it has to do is use the generate factors once with the integer, and it just compares the common factors with the list and the integer, and then adds it as a sum instead of returning it as a list. And then my next function is my isPrime functions, which makes use of another nested loop system, and basically takes an integer and then returns whether true or false based on that integer being prime. And then next prime is my next function, and basically returns the next integer of the past integer that is prime, and does this through using the isPrime function and finding out whether or not it's true or false. And then I've got my add digits function, which simply takes a string of values and then adds all the digits. Relatively simple. Next function is the is-intersecting function, which was relatively tricky to code at first, but all it uses is 6 parameters, obviously all including two different basically the equations of a circle, and then it uses the distance formula to calculate whether or not the distance between the 2 points x1, y1, and x2 and y2 is less than the two radius combined, and returns true if so, returns false if not. And obviously it does not work if the one circle is inside the other circle, but that's just a small exception. Sum of list every two basically finds the sum of the elements of the list, except skips every other one and only finds the sum of every two. And The quadratic formula function makes use of the quadratic formula to take in values a, b, and c and return two different x values for the intercepts. And then I use at the end of my math function, I use 4 different while loops, while loop functions, all of which find the next of something. So next divisible, which basically takes an integer and a denominator and finds the next integer that is divisible or factorable through that denominator, and is rather useful and interesting to see how it turns out. And then I've got my next number of factors, which takes in an integer and takes in a number of factors and returns an integer that has, or returns the next integer that has that set number of factors, or that past number of factors, which is pretty cool. Then I have my next add digits the same, which makes use of my add digits function and returns the next integer that has the same added digits, and is rather cool. And finally I have my next palindrome integer, which takes an integer and then calculates the next integer that is a palindrome. And it's quite cool because when you do use it, it doesn't always turn out to be the same. Like, for example, 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. It can be like 1, 2, 3, 2, 1, and it checks if it's palindrome, and if it is, and it works, and it's pretty cool, in my opinion. And now my reading and writing to text file functions, which include 3 functions: read from file, write to file, and write to file list remove elements. Thing about this is I didn't really go into depth, but what I do understand is the core concept of each, reading from a file and writing to a file. And my reading to the file basically takes all the contents of the text file and stores it, or returns it, and therefore you can store it in a variable. And what it does is it allows you to access a text file, which is pretty cool. And then my write to file function simply almost does the opposite. It takes and opens up a file based on your file name, and then it adds to that file your past file text, which is pretty cool because it means it's a really easy way of just adding something to a text file. And then I have my write to file list remove elements, which is basically an application of using a write to file function. However, all it does is it takes a file name, a list, and a character, and adds to that file name, or adds to that file, a list based on the removed elements of the character, because it makes use of the remove elements function. Finally, I will lastly talk about my error functions, as I'm running out of time here. And I have my divide by 0 error function and my index out of range error function. And what it does is it attempts to perform the division, and the exception, if there is an error through this line here, it returns simply cannot divide by 0, and that's only usually if b is equivalent to 0. That's the most common error that can occur. And then my next error function is index out of range, which is pretty cool because it takes a new list and then three like parameters, or count, check, and change of a counted loop, and then appends based to a new list based on those integers, and usually, like, because if b, for example, is a lot larger than the length of the actual list, it will go out of range, and then instead of just showing an error and just exiting the code, it just returns a simple statement saying string index is out of range instead, which is pretty cool because it means I don't run into an error. So, Mr. Miskew, this is my Summative class function, tools class of all my functions, which is very useful because I can use it in later on assignments or other program uses. And I go through a variety of different types of functions, all of which have pretty nifty and important uses. And I believe that this is a pretty well constructed tools class. Thank you for listening to my video on describing it, and I hope you enjoyed.